Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Kalember. I'm the Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy at Proofpoint, and today I'm here to talk with you about protecting people. And we all know that people are the new perimeter, and what an appropriate topic, of course, for Octane 20. Now, people have been a cybersecurity problem for a long, long time, certainly since cybersecurity was a thing. But actually, even in this particular era in which we find ourselves, where people are very obviously a perimeter. We've been moved to remote offices. We're all connecting even today in a virtual form. It really is difficult to argue that there's anything more important to protect than the people that we all rely on. Now, if you go all the way back into the history of protecting people and the information that those people have access to, you find yourself thousands of years before the present, in fact. And for a long time, the advantage actually lay with the people keeping information safe, a marked contrast to the era in which we find ourselves today. You might recognize the gentleman on the left there with his signature haircut. He lent his name to many, many things, including, of course, a salad. But more relevantly for our purposes, that is Julius Caesar, and his name is attached to what's known as the Caesar cipher. The Caesar cipher is what's known as a alphabetic substitution cipher. So in an incredibly simple sense, if I wanted to encrypt a message to you that maybe say, hi, I could say, the code is +1. And instead of sending across the message HI, I would send across the message IJ. You, knowing that the code is 1, could shift it back the other direction and understand what I was talking about. Now, that's incredibly simple. You do want to do it a little bit more complicated than that most of the time, but it was remarkable, in fact, how effective that was. That, in fact, had a multi-thousand-year run as a successful information security technique. You can actually date that form of information security or cryptography, if you like, all the way back to ancient Egypt. And it lasted until guys like the gentleman on the right, who's known as Al-Kindi. He actually was based in Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate. They invented something called frequency analysis, which, if you understand what language a message is written in, turns out to be a wonderful way to break into something that is encrypted with something like a Caesar cipher. And in fact, frequency analysis proved to be so powerful, basically looking at the ciphertext, meaning the scrambled message, and looking to see, all right, well, there's a lot of X's in this message. Maybe those represent a much more common letter. And if that message is encrypted in English, maybe it's an E or an N. You can figure out where the vowels are, where the consonants are, what the common letters are. And frequency analysis, if you have a long enough message, will probably allow you to crack it very, very, very quickly. Now, the advantage then was with the offensive side, people who were trying to compromise the security of information. And that lasted for what is not necessarily as good as the first run of a couple thousand years, where the defenders had the advantage. But nonetheless, it lasted until Renaissance Italy, at the very least. You might not recognize that gentleman on the left, but he's one of the classic underappreciated Renaissance men. His name was Leone Battista Alberti. And he was Genoese, so born in Genova. He was an architect, he was an artist, he was a poet, he was an author. He really could do it all. And that included, in fact, having the most revolutionary insight into information security since Al-Kindi and the Abbasids invented frequency analysis. And what he realized was that, well, the Caesar cipher is very easily crackable in its traditional sense, but what if you did it twice? What if you did a polyalphabetic substitution cipher and used 2 alphabets? So you can imagine turning that dial there. If you understood what 2 places you would orient the 2 wheels to, you could, in fact, encrypt a message in a much stronger way than you could do with a simple substitution cipher, like the Caesar cipher was. Interestingly, it didn't really get implemented in Alberti's lifetime. And in fact, he did know a cryptographer working for one of the foremost practitioners of information security at the time. It was the Pope, actually, who played around with this a little bit, but it actually took another couple hundred years, because it is a little bit of a pain to encrypt messages that way, for it to reach its sort of final form. And it did so through the work of not an Italian, but a Frenchman. That guy on the left there, his name is Blaise de Visionnaire. And what you see on the right there is what's known as a Visionnaire Square. A Visionnaire Square is basically the same thing as an Alberti cipher, but you can see that there are two lines that are mapped out here in a square format, and you need a key to make it work. And the key is not just where you orient the wheels, so to speak, in the Alberti cipher. It can be a letter. It can be a whole sentence if you want it to be, and you're encrypting a long enough message. So if I'm going to say hi to you again, and the key that we are going to use is Okta, well, I'll go to that row there along the top. I'll find the O. I'll go down to the letter H. That will get me to a V. So I'll send you a letter V. And then the second letter, I'm going to encrypt according to my key, which is K. Again, the second letter of Okta, and the letter I want to encipher is an I. So I will go down there. If my eyes are not deceiving me, I find that to be an S. So I would send you a message that's VS. It doesn't mean I want to fight you or versus or anything like that. It just means I want to say hi if you understand that I'm encrypting according to this Visionnaire Square, and the key is, in fact, Okta. In that case, I'm really in great shape. It's very, very hard to figure out how to crack a message like that because guess what? Frequency analysis doesn't work. So now the defenders have the upper hand, and the defenders had the upper hand for a long, 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 long time. And they did so until this guy came along. You might recognize the name or the face. Hopefully not the face. He looks rather grumpy there, but certainly the name. He's Charles Babbage. Right? He's one of the parents of modern computing, for sure, along with Ada Lovelace and quite a few others. But he was, of course, famous for inventing the difference engine, which really is the forerunner of the modern computer. As you imagine, he had lots of hobbies, one of which was cracking encrypted messages. And he actually figured out how to attack the Visionnaire Square. And you don't do it actually by attacking the message itself. You do it by attacking the key. So rather than going after the message hi, you would, in my previous example, go after the key Okta. And you can actually use frequency analysis to do so. Once Babbage proved that that technique could work at scale, code-breaking offices all over the world were in business, and they led to actually major events in world history happening in a way that could have gone down very differently. Most famous of which is probably what's known as the Zimmermann telegram, where Germany sent a message to Mexico about allying against the US to keep them out of the European front of World War I. Eventually actually caused a lot of diplomatic pressure to get the US involved in World War I, and world history might be very different had Babbage not been able to move these techniques forward and German cryptography not been so bad during World War I. But of course, when we start to tell the story of cybersecurity, we often do so starting with real computers, so to speak. They actually get implemented in practice. And there's no more famous example of that than what the codebreakers did at Bletchley Park to break into the cryptography used by the Nazis, which was a whole lot stronger than what the Germans were using during World War I. You see on the left, of course, the famous Enigma machine. There were lots of versions of an Enigma machine, but it's much more complicated than a Visionnaire Square. There are different rotors that have numbers, if you can see them there. Those correspond to letters of the alphabet, so they can be placed in 26 different positions. You can actually flip them. You can put them in any order you want, all of which would be agreed upon with a code book. And you have those plug boards up front there where you can actually swap where letters go in the ciphertext. So that is a really much more complicated mechanism to try and decipher. And of course, the heroes of our story are people like Alan Turing, shown there on the right, who actually did figure out how to crack into Enigma's encryption. They did so not necessarily, though, by solely exploiting it technically. As it happens, a lot of military communication is very predictable. If you are running an army, one of the things you want to tell people every day is what the weather's going to be. Weather forecasts are very, very important for things like troop movements, supply chains, etc., supply convoys, rather. And that meant that an army, being very regimented, as armies tend to be, would often send out a message at the same time of day when the word Wetter, W-E-T-T-E-R in German, would often appear there. It was, in fact, the human misuse of the Enigma machine that gave codebreakers like Turing the upper hand in finally figuring out how to crack Enigma. And you can actually contrast that with what happened in other areas of that same German military. The Kriegsmarine, which is the German Navy, used their Enigma machines in a way that was totally not predictable. So those little words there, like Wetter or cribs, as they were known in Bletchley Park, were not available. And in fact, the Kriegsmarine wasn't actually compromised in the same sense as the German army was. They had to actually lose a sub with a code book in it to have their information security compromised. But that all leads us to where we find ourselves today. Now, this is easily my favorite XKCD comic, and just to read it out to you quickly, you have a crypto nerd imagining, oh, this laptop's encrypted, let's build $1 million cluster to crack it, or actually pay $1 million to AWS or something to crack it. No good, it's 4096-bit RSA, blast, our evil plan is foiled. But what would actually happen? His laptop's encrypted, drug him and let's hit him with this $5 wrench until he tells us the password. Got it. And in fact, that would work because frankly, the weak link in the system is not anything technical. And going back really throughout the entire history of offense and defense and keeping information safe or cracking into it, it really was people at the center the entire time. Doesn't matter how good the cryptography was, if it were used incorrectly, there was always a weak link to find. And certainly in 2020, we find that to be the case. Broadly speaking, defense in security hasn't really focused on people very much, at least security turned into cybersecurity. But if you look at any source of information, and I just picked the one that is the closest to canonical in our world, which is the Verizon data breach report, which in 2019 attributed 94% of breaches, starting with simple attacks, not necessarily simple attacks, but attacks targeting people, starting primarily with the email vector. But in cybersecurity, that's not at all where we're spending our money, our time, our effort, where we've really trained our sites. And it turns out, in fact, that if you look at the cybersecurity problem even more broadly than that, one of the things that you will notice is, in fact, it's even more people-centric than it appears at first glance. Because this is a data breach caused by an external party, someone cracking into your environment, trying to get access to data that they shouldn't have access to. But when you're really factoring in the full scope of potential problems from a cybersecurity perspective, you cannot forget about insiders. In fact, they're responsible for about 34% of breaches, citing, again, that same 2019 Verizon DBIR. And so really 96% of the problem that we're all trying to solve here in keeping information safe is a problem that starts with a person and not fundamentally a technology. More to the point, one of the things that we see in the current threat landscape that is absolutely indisputable is that for a couple of years now, attacks have been targeted at people. There's an old saying, often attributed to Bruce Schneier, that professionals target people, amateurs target systems. And increasingly, and I'll show a little bit of data on this in a second, the attacks are also human activated. The one other thing that seems to have joined the party is that these threats are also now increasingly human operated. The best example of this is ransomware, which used to be almost an entirely automated form of attack. Now it is mutated into a completely different form in which a simple malware infection will turn into a human attacker manually using the same sort of tools that information security professionals often use to gain increased access into an environment, which would then be monetized by installing ransomware on every computer within the domain using management tools that are available mostly for IT personnel to use. And the other way in which that has manifested itself is a massive rise in the economic loss that is likeliest to happen to any company of any size these days. And it is a technically simple attack. It is not about any genius level galaxy brain work on the part of the attackers to exploit our technology, our systems, etc. It is a simple attack that relies on compromising access, passwords, and in some cases even simply spoofing email messages. And we first really saw this as a massive problem in about 2015. You see the FBI released a first set of stats around business email compromise, which is a very confusing term, but it encompasses everything from a supply chain partner whose email has been taken over by an attacker through to a CEO being spoofed by an attacker to try and convince someone to send money to the wrong place, and a whole host of variants of that. Back in 2015, we saw the real first issue there, And we saw payroll diversions. We saw W-2s being compromised here in the US. Around the world, we saw similar schemes with other kind of tax refunds. And of course, we saw some wire transfer activity. Back then, it was a $1.2 billion problem, at least in terms of reported losses. And now, in fact, it is north of a $25 billion problem, a 2,000% increase. And this is, again, the least sophisticated cyber threat, if we're going to use that term, that we can possibly think of. Now, the landscape by attack type is a fascinating way through which to view this type of attacker activity. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the nuances between what we call credential stealing malware and other forms of malware, but really these are attacks that are much more about compromising a person, what that person has access to. The number one family in malware is not a banking Trojan that's straight going to steal your money, or even something like ransomware, or something that's going to mine cryptocurrency. It's going to be something that steals your access credential. Most of the time, that is going to be, of course, a password. And that is the sort of thing that absolutely dominates the threat landscape today. Even credential phishing, which we think of as an old attack, it's 20 plus years old at this point, remains an incredibly active part of the landscape because, again, these attacks pay off so well. Now, one thing that they have absolutely mutated into is something that is going to even create worse karma for cyber criminals than they already have. You can see, of course, the trend that is absolutely pronounced. Most of us who have been in information security for a long time have never quite seen anything like this. Basically, every type of attacker on planet Earth is now doing the same thing, meaning they're attaching COVID-19 or coronavirus to their lures to try and get people to click on things. Some of those are trying to steal credentials. Some of those are trying to install malware. And some of those, like you can see the upper right example there, that's a pure social engineering attempt. Right? I'm stuck here. People have tested positive near me. I need you to do something for me urgently, which is probably going to be send a wire transfer if someone actually replies to an email like that. So these people are going to hell. But really, this is all about social engineering. These are not technically sophisticated attacks at all. If you look at the entire threat landscape, really that social engineering is where all of the innovation is occurring. Now, the number one group behind more malware than any other group on planet Earth right now is one that we track. They're commonly known as the motet group. They're now sending things from compromised Office 365 accounts. They're replying to real threads that might be in your inbox with malware. That's what innovation from the attacker side looks like. And if you're really looking at the data here, there's some inescapable conclusions. Now we're at the point where over 99% of the ways in which you will be attacked depend on human interaction to be successful. If you don't click on their malware, if you don't run their code for them, if you don't give them your access credential, if you don't actually do their bidding and send a wire or send data, their attack will not work. And that is as close to a defining characteristic as we can find in the threat landscape in 2020. Secondly, their infrastructure is no longer bad guy infrastructure. It's not malicious stuff that we can track on a regular basis because the cloud has changed the world of IT, and it's also changed the world of attacker IT. Right? If you can host your payloads on Microsoft Office 365, you have absolutely no need to host it on compromised infrastructure that is part of a botnet. And that is an extraordinary thing that changes how we need to think about protecting our people. Now, the threats themselves are often more complicated than they were before. There are different stages that involve human interaction. You can see a very famous variation there. This is the Ryuk malware that has taken down American cities, the LA Times, lots of other famous targets. You know, it's not just a simple phishing email. There's a bunch of stuff contained with it. So really, even that part of the landscape is innovation led, but it doesn't work unless people click on it. And then finally, that BEC and EAC world, so business email compromise and another unhelpful three-letter acronym from the FBI, email account compromise, has started to really blend email, cloud, and all of the ways in which we work to try and create incredibly effective ways to compromise us. And some of those are the least technically sophisticated attacks you can possibly imagine. And really, I think the way to understand them is really in two big categories. Attackers are doing one of two things. They're trying to pretend to be you, or they're actually becoming you. If they're going to pretend to be you, they're using one of three main techniques. Either they're sending email from your own email address, which they can do actually if you don't authenticate your email. It's a separate topic, but nonetheless an important one. Or they can simply put your name on the display name, the friendly name that shows up when you look at your mobile phone, you look at that Outlook app and you see a simple name without the email address attached to it. You might actually simply just fall for that. If they're doing a little bit more work, they might register a domain that looks like your company's domain, your organization's domain, and send email from that. But in all those cases, they're basically just pretending to be you. And this is some of the least sophisticated techniques on the planet. Any one of you can Google email spoofing tool and be doing this in less than 5 minutes. The second way, and perhaps the more complicated way that this particular family of techniques has been brought to bear, is techniques to basically actually become you. So the same way that attackers are starting to create infrastructure out of compromised Office 365 accounts, like we saw with the motet example, they're very, very good at using simple techniques from password sprays, phishing, and to some extent malware. We saw actually stealers being the number one category there, to simply take over an account. And that means that you can be used to attack your colleagues, you can be used to attack your supply chain, or your supply chain can be used to attack you. Or, of course, you can simply use that access to steal data. At this point, we have so much connected to those cloud accounts that it becomes one of the most useful things available to an attacker. And speaking of those cloud accounts, when you look at the statistics, if nothing else comes across in this presentation, you should really, really see how prevalent it is to have accounts being taken over. About 85% of our own customers who are really security-focused organizations have detected these password spray style attacks. 45% of them are successfully compromised. And you might think, oh, I have MFA, that's going to be a silver bullet there. And to be sure, everyone should have MFA, but very often MFA doesn't apply to every single application in your environment. You might still allow SMTP or an older protocol like IMAP, and the attackers know this, and they take advantage of it. And much like ants, if you see one, you're likely to have more than one. So if you have one compromised account, in fact, the average number that we see out there in the wild is 13. And all of this is used in the service of those not necessarily technically sophisticated, but nonetheless incredibly harmful attacks that are more effective at compromising money and data than anything else. And at their core, what they are trying to do is leverage pure social engineering. These are not attackers making innovations on exploiting your Windows machines or your servers or your cloud workloads. They don't have to do any of that because social engineering and compromised user accounts enable them to achieve what they're trying to achieve. And if you look at this across different sectors, it is pretty staggering the rate at which you see successful compromises of accounts. And higher ed's a tough security problem, but a lot of these other verticals like construction engineering, manufacturing, they have complicated supply chains, money moves around all over the place. They are absolutely in the crosshairs of the vast majority of cyber criminals out there. So in a world like that, how do you actually understand risk? It's not really so much about the attackers and their infrastructure. It's really about who's getting attacked. And again, this doesn't work unless people fall for it. So it requires effectively flipping the paradigm. We're not thinking about a world that's defined by network diagrams or even really cloud services at this point. We're thinking about people. And if you think about the people in your environment, it's not necessarily going to be obvious which ones need the most protection. You might think that's your C-suite. You might think it's your board of directors. You might think it's people that can move money. And to a large extent, that's probably true. But why wouldn't you actually get the data behind that? Why wouldn't you actually dig into the problem of figuring out who in your organization is not just a VIP, but is what we would call a VAP, a very attacked person? Now, the way you would start in an analysis like that is probably by figuring out who the adversaries are interested in. And they're telling you every day whether you're paying attention or not. People get different sorts of threats. There are those who get more interesting targeted threats that have more dangerous payloads that are coming from more sophisticated actors. If you're not measuring that, though, it's very, very hard to understand who in your environment is actually going to need greater protection. But just being attacked is not enough. As we saw from the details behind the threat landscape, there's not really technical vulnerabilities at work here. What we're mostly dealing with is pure social engineering attacks. So if people don't fall for them, it doesn't matter if they're the most attacked person in your entire organization. They're not even going to represent the slightest bit of risk. If, on the other hand, you have some person who receives one attack a year, but they fall for it every time, that in fact means greater risk for the organization. So figuring out who's likely to fall for the social engineering, meaning people who click on things, they fail their awareness training, or they simply don't take it. They use risky devices. They use cloud services they're not supposed to. They're more vulnerable than your average person, and you need to protect them a little bit more. Now, the third leg of this stool, once you've identified who's being attacked, who's likely to fall for those attacks, it's really about who hurts you if they're successfully compromised. And that is privilege, for lack of a better term. And this is, again, tightly bound up with this whole concept of identity that we're spending a lot of time talking about today. So if you think about what privilege means in your organization, that privilege could be you have access to sensitive data that matters to the organization. You have access to perhaps something more important than that. Maybe you have a local administrator access to your computer. And so therefore, if the attacker compromises you, they can use you to laterally spread to other targets. Maybe you have access to a payment system and you can actually move money around. All those notions really help you understand risk in a people-centric way, which aligns to the same way that the adversaries are trying to attack you. Now, this doesn't happen without a little bit of work on the back end. So most of the time, each attack that you're attempting to understand is going to be evaluated in a couple of different ways. You want to know, is this an attack that went to just me or everybody on planet Earth? Was it a type of attack I care about, like a remote access Trojan? Or maybe it's credential phishing, and I have multi-factor authentication through Okta across every single one of my interfaces, so I don't care very much. Or it's a crypto miner, which could be a headache, a nuisance, but it's not likely to actually cause risk for my organization. And then finally, you want to know, is this a sophisticated group? Is this someone I care about as an adversary? And when you actually do that, you can take a look at every single threat going to every single person in your organization. This is, in fact, a joint Proofpoint and Okta customer that I wanted to use the data on because I thought it was a really profound story. There's actually a large financial services organization. And if you look at the entirety of this organization, they have tens of thousands of people. They have 24, 24 people that qualify as very attacked. And you can actually see the curve there if you have really good eyes. Sorry, it's not a little bit bigger. But every single one of those dots moving left to right across the x-axis represents a single person in that organization and the threat load that they're under, given how interesting they are to the adversaries you care about. And most of them are not actually very attacked at all. Above a certain point, though, there's a small group of people that are carrying a huge amount of the threat load. They are extraordinarily targeted. Now, who those people are, in this case, their CFO was on that list. That makes sense. A payroll administrator was on that list. Also makes sense. An accounts payable person. That checks out for sure. And then there was someone who was more interesting. And I was actually just talking to the security team, this organization last week, and it was this VP of platform services who was quite well known inside that organization. They were all somewhat blown away that he was the third most attacked person at that entire company. They were almost falling over each other to go tell him because he was the one who insisted on having access to everything. Somehow the attackers had figured out that this one guy down in Florida actually had access that would parallel any other person in the entirety of that organization. And he was absolutely at the top of their list. And when you can understand risk in those terms, you can really start to put together a unified story that helps you understand your attack surface, what you need to defend the same way that your adversaries understand you. Now, there's lots of different ways to look at this data. This is an anonymized version, so it's not an actual organization here. But a critical point here is that the attacks that different people get are not always the same. In a lot of organizations that haven't implemented multi-factor authentication, that don't have great control over their application access, that maybe allow people to go straight to Office 365 via insecure protocols, you're going to see the attackers use a lot of credential phishing. And they'll use credential phishing for people whose access they want to compromise. For others, they might have to do different things entirely that require more manual effort. Rats or keyloggers or other sorts of malware families that a human is going to have to operate behind a keyboard. It's just not going to work in an automated sense. And you'll see very, very different threat profiles once you start digging into this data. You'll actually see some people that don't receive any phishing or malware at all. All they receive are those social engineering attacks that try and fool them into doing something that they're not supposed to do. And that's not uncommon to see at all. Each organization is unique in that regard, and each organization has very, very different adversaries. And they're telling you all day, every day, what's interesting about you to them. And that understanding is absolutely critical to actually be able to lower the risk that pertains to all of the people that now become our perimeter that we have to protect. But understanding that perimeter, again, is not just a matter of understanding how attacked it is. So, for example, we want to maybe dig into each of those people and understand them in a slightly more nuanced way, kind of in the same vein of thinking as that Venn diagram. Maybe we want to look at our CEO and say, all right, that person's, she's a VIP. She's pretty heavily attacked. She's gotten a threat that we consider pretty interesting, and she's actually clicked on something. This is the intersection of the Venn diagram. This person represents a ton of risk to us. But maybe the executive assistant down there for the CFO might represent more of a risk to the organization overall. That person's gotten lots of different attacks and has clicked on them and has never been trained. We've never actually figured out if she would, or he in this case, would click on a simulated phishing attack. And we don't actually have a very good understanding of whether that person is aware of how they should respond to a threat in their inbox, or whether they're going to report that. They haven't ever reported anything before. So really, we have to assume they're pretty vulnerable. And again, when you pair up these types of analyses, you start to really be able to understand what risk means in this modern threat landscape, in which people are the target, people activate the threats, and your adversaries, by and large, are also human. Now, moving on from there, I wanted to actually highlight a really powerful integration that the Proofpoint teams and the Okta teams did together. Because as you can imagine, even when you do have this level of understanding, and certainly this is something that we at Proofpoint have spent a lot of time and effort in trying to secure for our customers, you then have to figure out, all right, now that I get this, how do I better protect people? And there's no better tool for doing that than Okta via its Okta Identity Cloud. Now, if you look at what we can identify is, basically who are those very attacked people, and they change every day. So this is the sort of thing that we have to make dynamic. We have to provide it via an API so it can be easily consumable by the types of technologies, most obviously Okta, that can actually then put that understanding into active practice. Take actual measures to better protect these people that we've now identified as risky. Now, once we've identified those VAPs, what are we going to do with them? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to create a list of them, and that is going to be a dynamic list. It's going to change every day of the week. It's going to change every 5 minutes, because attackers, as we've seen, never let up. They're constantly targeting different people inside our environments. So now we've got that list created, and it's going to get exported, again, dynamically into the Okta Identity Cloud. Now, that Identity Cloud is, again, going to consume this information as it changes in real time. So just because you are a very attacked person today doesn't mean you will be one next week, next month, next year. So that Okta Identity Cloud now gives us all kinds of opportunities to enforce better security controls now that we've not only identified, but are starting to actually mitigate risk. So those VAPs then become part of the VAP group in the Okta Identity Cloud. Exactly what you'd want to do. Again, no manual effort involved in this whatsoever. It is a fantastic idea to go talk to these people and say, look, at this entire organization, you are amongst the most attacked people. Cyber criminals are super interested in what you have access to. And this is actually one of the more fascinating parts of my job. I've gotten to do that, and I've gotten to do that hundreds of different times now. And as it happens, the reaction of a typical person when they are told, you are a VAP, you are absolutely under attack now, more so than almost any other person at this company or this organization, their reaction is not terror or paranoia or anything that I might have considered by default rational. Their reaction is they feel special. It's flattering. Like, okay, fantastic. I'm a VAP. You sure? Great. Where's my special protection? Roll up the black SUV full of security personnel for me. And that might actually be exactly the role Okta plays in this. So now we have our group of VAPs. They are now added to a group in the Okta Identity Cloud. Again, that's dynamically generated. And then we can apply adaptive security policies to them. So if you're a VAP, maybe you have to log in with MFA all the time because I know you're under attack and I need to know more about each authentication decision that I make around you and whether to allow you access to a given application. Maybe I take away your access to the crown jewels. Maybe I change something else about how that works in order for you to not only be better authenticated, be enrolled in stronger authentication factors. Maybe it's about what you have access to, how you sign on, your roles and entitlements, and even your password policy. I can change all those things dynamically, not just because I want to tighten security for the sake of tightening security, but because this is a powerful way to take my understanding of my risk, which is, again, encapsulated in the form of people and departments and what they have access to, the sort of thing that really, really matters to any organization, regardless of what its mission happens to be. And now I'm using the power of Proofpoint and Okta together in order to actually make that into a real dynamic control. And I don't even have to do any of the work. It's a simple API connection that I can turn on in 5 minutes. Really, really powerful stuff. And this has been really well received by those who have implemented it. So now let's put this in a broader context. So if we're going to do people-centric security, what is the universe of things that we have to look at? Now that identity and VAP integration is a great place to start, but this is a broader problem than that. So when you really want to think about a people-centric security strategy, really it boils down to 3 key elements. And these are not rocket science, but there's only so many ways that an adversary has to attack a person. Now, most of the time that's external email. They might use, again, those spoofing techniques, which play such a massive role in business email compromise, which, as we've mentioned, is the most expensive security problem on planet Earth right now. They might compromise you and go after your colleague, the internal email example that we saw from motet. They might go directly after your cloud accounts, as we saw them doing with O365 and G Suite, or they might even pivot over to your personal webmail. That happens at really well-defended organizations all the time. So the first thing you want to do is understand how your people are being targeted and obviously protect them. And ideally, you also want to learn as much as possible about which people you need to do the best job protecting. But again, we've seen this is not enough. For the attackers, they need somebody to fall for this. So they need your protections to fail, and they need the social engineering to work. So the second way to really make their job difficult is by awareness and training, making people themselves more resilient against any threat that they face. None of this, though, is ever going to be perfect. There are no silver bullets in cybersecurity. So once you've been able to do that, you're protecting people in the ways that they're targeted. You're making them as resilient as you possibly can make them. You also then want to extend that to protecting the data that people create and access. Some of that is traditional sort of data loss prevention, which you can do across the sources that matter to your organization. Maybe you rely heavily on email, cloud applications, or other things that you need to bear in mind. But all of this is a way to kind of bring your security controls, your security strategy much more in line with how you're being attacked. As those risks, as we saw from the Verizon DBIR, almost all pertain to your people. Now, one of the things I want to close with here is a look toward the future. Now, you might, if you have incredibly good eyesight or you're viewing this in full screen, be able to pick out some interesting details in this particular letter here. But I want to call your attention to the date. It's dated January the 17th, 1949. And for those of you who are very, very fast readers, you might have realized that This is an investigation of someone in Lagos, Nigeria, who's conducting a scheme to obtain money through the mails via false and fraudulent pretenses. This is actually an investigation conducted by the U.S. Postmaster General, again, 1949. This is the first Nigerian prince investigation. And the Nigerian print scheme itself is something called advanced fee fraud, which has a history dating all the way back to the French Revolution. There is nothing new under the sun when it comes to cybersecurity and this landscape in which we find ourselves, because we've gotten to the point where with the cloud, with a lot of the technology that we've built, we do know how to build secure systems. Now, we didn't always know how to do that, but one of the curious things about the entire world of information security and how we think about protecting people and data is that it came of age in this brief little blip of time where we actually didn't know how to write secure code, where we were running incredibly insecure operating systems and browsers and other software like Flash that was just so full of technical vulnerabilities. So it was actually easier to fool the computer into doing your bidding than to fool a person into doing your bidding. That, though, looks increasingly anomalous as we put it into perspective. As we get further away from the era of Windows NT and Flash and Internet Explorer and further forward into the era of cloud and technologies like Okta and all of the different modern operating systems, which are so much harder to exploit than they used to be, it starts to look clear in retrospect that we should have always been focusing on people. They will always represent the easiest attack vector for our adversaries. And being able to understand the world in those terms is essential to a modern risk management strategy. Now, briefly about Proofpoint. We are the most deployed solution to protect the number one threat vector, which happens to be email and other people-centric attacks in the Fortune 100, the Fortune 1000. I wanted to call out specifically healthcare here. The message around protecting people, I think, is one that you can interpret lots of different ways. Our healthcare personnel are right on the front lines right now, protecting all of us during, of course, this completely unprecedented pandemic, at least in most of our lives, unless you happen to live through the Spanish flu in 1918. And we're proud to be able to protect as many of those organizations as possible. We are proud to be the most deployed solution in the Fortune 100 to health and life sciences, the Fortune 1000, and the largest nonprofits out there that are really doing incredibly important work. Of the large cybersecurity companies out there, we're top 5 if you want to be specific these days. And we're the only one that is that level of organization, that scale of organization. Our guidance is that we'll do over $1 billion in revenue this year, and we are focused solely on protecting people. We're not doing firewalls or antivirus or anything like that. And as you can see on the right, we are seamlessly integrated with other next-gen leaders, most obviously Okta, in the way in which I just described. So now then, I want to leave you with a couple of key takeaways in terms of how best to protect your people and really turn the tide on this threat landscape in which we really seem like we're not aligned from a defender standpoint with what the attackers are doing. Now, if you, again, go back to the very start, attackers exploiting human vulnerability is not new. And so if you're going to properly understand the threat landscape now and well into the future, you should understand it in human terms. People, departments, what they have access to. Are they attacked? Are they vulnerable? That's the sort of thing that will make it easier for you to mitigate that risk. And speaking of that risk, that is an incredibly powerful way to do your security analytics. If you can say, our payroll department is incredibly attacked, or our nurses are more attacked than our physicians, and our pharmacists are the most attacked of all. That's the sort of thing that senior management really does understand when it comes to understanding risk. And then finally, the Okta and Proofpoint integrations, and I'm admitting my bias here, are a fantastic start in a journey toward people-centric security, with Proofpoint helping you understand which of your people are the most targeted and the most vulnerable, and Okta doing fantastic work in order to actually make them better protected on an ongoing basis. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation and have a great rest of Octane 20. Thank you again.